Poland is bound to become one of the main economies of Europe, a transformation that just a few decades ago seemed unthinkable. Then, 85 years ago to be precise, the country had fallen under Nazi and Soviet occupation and became one of the main victims of World War II. The biggest conflict in Europe in modern history left the country in shambles and turned into a communist republic that achieved little success in guaranteeing its citizens their basic economic needs. Under the communist rule, the country spent over 40 years economically underdeveloped. Yet today, 2 decades later, the eastern country is the 6th European Union member in terms of GDP, and its growth rate has made it into one of the main economic powerhouses of the Euro Club for much of the last 20 years. Yet the country, once invaded by the Soviet Union, keeps a constant wariness towards the Russian expansionist aims. Even before the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, the Polish state had increased its military expenditure. In 2022, when Russian boots stepped on Ukrainian soil, Warsaw was already spending over 2.4% of its GDP on arming itself, an effort that allowed the country to rank 3rd among the NATO members, surpassed only by the US and Greece. The war in Ukraine only increased Polish suspicions, to the point that in April 2024, its foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, went out of his way to warn Vladimir Putin against a war with its country. In any case, at the current pace, the Eastern European country is on the path to becoming one of the EU's main economic and military powers in the next decades. So you might be asking yourself, how will Poland become Europe's next superpower? Whereas Poland's growth and economic might are nowadays undeniable, it might not be a question of what the country has that others don't, but rather about what it doesn't have anymore. Roughly a century ago, Poland wasn't the economic powerhouse it is today. After the Second World War, the country had become a communist republic, tightly allied with Moscow. In Poland, the communist leadership aimed to bring the Polish economy out of its persistent dependence on agriculture. As such, between the 40s and the 60s, Soviet planning successfully turned it into a state-run industrial economy. A successful transformation that soon ran dry. In the 70s, the economy started to stagnate, while the state kept increasing due to the growth of the communist bureaucracy. The country's public accounts started to accumulate a growing deficit. By the 80s, rampant hyperinflation and the swelling Soviet state ended up provoking a serious economic crisis. By then, the whole communist bloc was coming down in pieces. When the economic transformation of the country began, in the late 80s, most of the European liberal countries that had market economies had considerably higher life standards. As such, the Polish economy was uniquely well situated to enjoy a long period of growth, especially when compared with other countries that have been growing at a faster rate for longer. Right after the Iron Curtain came down in 1990, the gap in GDP per capita between Poland and the neighbouring Germany was almost 13-1. The end of Soviet rule brought an opportunity cleverly used by the Polish political and economic elites. Once the end of the communist regime became a reality in 1989, with the fall of the last communist government and the rise of the Liberal Solidarity Party, capitalism had a chance to take over the Polish economy. In a new political context, the new Polish leaders had the chance to pursue a liberalizing agenda while keeping a robust public welfare system. Under the first Solidarity government, the state companies were transformed into state-owned companies, which lately allowed for the sale of assets and companies. This route proved beneficial for both the state and the economic situation of the country. The Polish state received a sizable injection of wealth in exchange for its assets, and companies started to thrive under a more capitalistic approach. By 1992, the country's GDP was growing at a 2.5 annual rate, a pace that increased to an average of 5.3 throughout most of the 90s. Since then, and excluding 2013 and 2020, the Polish economy has enjoyed consistent tailwinds that have kept its GDP growth rate above 1%. After the economic reforms put an end to communist planning, and once the Poles were reaping the benefits of being part of the global economy, the country was ready to take the ultimate economic leap, joining the EU. Before Polish accession, the country already had a trade agreement in place with the EU, a deal that allowed Poland to access the European markets and helped boost the growth of the Polish economy. By 2003, the year prior to its entrance in the EU, the country was growing its GDP steadily at a pace that, on average, surpassed 2%. On the 1st of May 2004, the eastern country joined the exclusive European Union club. This step had a massive impact on the Polish economy. It brought down the trade barriers between the newly added member and the 15 countries that were already part of the Union, allowing for the free movement of people and goods. Suddenly, the costs for Polish businesses to sell to their wealthier European neighbours decreased considerably. It also had a huge impact on the EU as a whole, given that the newly joined member was the largest and most popular country to join the EU. Joining the EU gave Poland an additional set of tailwinds. Between 2010 and 2016, the country got 2.7% of its GDP in EU transfers every year. It is difficult to understate the impact that EU transfers have had on the Polish economy. And so, one of the main economic advantages of Poland turned out to be its neighbours. One of the biggest assets for Poland might be its 467-kilometre border with Germany. The German neighbour, the biggest economy in the European continent and the fourth in the world, has been, for a long time, a reliable and extremely wealthy economic partner for Poland. Starting in 2004, with Poland joining the EU, the two neighbouring economies became tightly intertwined. Germany got a sizable pool of cheaper workers, and Poland got access to a huge market to place its goods. Both economies started benefiting from the proximity, and the Polish economy soon started to mirror that of its wealthy German neighbour. By 2008, when the global financial crisis exploded, Germany was already the destination of a big share of Polish exports. In that same year, 25% of Polish exports were directed to Germany. This over-reliance helped Poland fare well during the Great Recession. The good economic standing of the Germans protected their economy, as well as the eastern neighbours. So much so that even when the German GDP tanked in 2009, Poland's kept growing at a steady 2.8%. It was thanks to another protective factor that shielded the country from economic contagion. Even though the intention was to incorporate Poland into the currency union, and thus substitute the Polish zloty with the euro, when the finance crisis started, the country was in control of its own monetary policy, a crucial tool for states to deal with economic hardship. By avoiding the 2008 crisis, Poland managed to protect itself from the economic decline suffered by other EU members such as Spain, Italy, and Greece. And so, when the EU as a bloc finally entered a period of modest economic recovery, the Polish neighbour already was at a better starting point. Yet, the economic growth the country has achieved for decades doesn't matter much when geopolitics come knocking on the door. Poland still shares over 400 kilometres of border with Belarus, a close Moscow ally, one also that may be storing Russian nuclear short-range missiles since last spring. So it is not particularly surprising that, with their newly acquired wealth, the Polish have been heavily investing in growing their military. As we said before, by 2022, the country was already investing 2.4% of its GDP in its defence budget. Then, after Russian soldiers started trying to take over Ukrainian territory, the Poles not only set its military expenditure to grow even more, but also started to call on other NATO countries to do the same. According to Poland's foreign minister, Radosław Sikorski, the goal is to get the country's defense budget to reach 5% of the GDP by 2025, which would mean the budget has increased a whopping 10% to reach such a target. The other NATO countries say the president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, might not need to go as far, but they need to reach at least a defense budget that is 3% of their economic output. Meanwhile, if such increases in the Polish defense budgets continue, the country can soon be both an economic but also military superpower within the EU. The plan of the Poles is to reinforce its army with a hefty bounty of weapon purchases while increasing its land forces to reach the 300,000 mark. Well on track to become the continent's mightiest army, a position that will render better guarantees for the Poles in face of potential aggression by any other country. At the same time, in a global context, Poland has already entered the top 15 countries with higher military spending in absolute terms, right after Australia, Italy, and South Korea. At the same time, the country has already assumed its new role as a European superpower to be. It has been one of the main allies of Ukraine in its fight against the Russian invasion. The eastern country has already strengthened its relationship with the bordering country, with Poland serving as Ukraine's logistics hub, refugee sanctuary, and weapons provider. In this endeavour, Warsaw can brag about being the 8th country that has sent more aid to Kyiv in the world, with more than 4.3 billion euros. A set of directions and circumstances that put Poland well on track to become the EU's next superpower.